The needle on the petrol gauge had just dropped into the red when Barker saw the sign. "Beware of the children," it read. Though he quickly assumed that it had been put there to protect the children themselves from the motorists rather than vice versa, it nonetheless sent a chill down his spine, and he glanced at his watch and from the corner of his eye noticed that the evening was drawing darkness into itself quickly. The car would give him another 20 or 30 miles before it needed filling up again, and he could find a petrol station in one of the small towns on the other side of the A12 when he'd finished here. He'd be alright for now. He'd spent what felt like best part of a day driving across Suffolk looking for this place, and now he was here he wasn't about to get distracted too easily. He swung the car into the bend, away from the carriageway, and into deep shadows. So this was it, he thought, the road to Brockhampton Institute. The place was legendary. He'd been reading about it for years and wanting to visit it almost as long. Trying to come up with an idea for a photo feature to sell to a popular paranormal magazine had given him the ideal opportunity, and now he felt a delicious thrill as he nosed the car deeper into the remote countryside. Spindly trees overhung the track and reached for him with gnarled limbs. Here in the gloom, everything looked stale or dead. It was hard to believe that this track could ever have led to any kind of institute, even one as remote and demanding of privacy as Brockhampton had been. The very thought of the things that used to take place here benefiting from its remote location and inaccessibility made his skin crawl. He navigated the track carefully, headlights picking out gaping potholes and tree roots. It was getting darker than he would have liked, but he wasn't about to risk doing the vehicle any damage by going faster over this kind of terrain. He promised himself that he would stay no longer than was necessary to give the building the quick once-over, soak up the atmosphere, shoot off a roll of film, and make his way back to the main road. It wasn't that the expedition bothered him. If he was that easily spooked, then he would never have volunteered himself for such a trip, but it had already taken up much more of his time than he would have liked. After another 100 yards, the track ended at a set of iron gates, and he pulled the car over to the embankment with a groan, as if gates were needed to keep anyone away after such a hostile track as that. He couldn't see from here if they were locked or not. He'd have to get out and check for himself. The temperature had been pleasantly warm all day, and it was only slightly cooler now with the evening darkness as he strode for short distance. A metal plaque on the gatepost was made illegible by age and weathering. The gates were locked. He curled his fists around the rusted bars and shook them as much as he dared, but their noise in the stillness of the evening jarred at his nerves, and he slumped against them. He would have to climb the gates and walk the rest of the way. Barker returned to his car long enough to shrug on his jacket, sling his rucksack and camera over his shoulder. The gates clanged and shook as he hoisted his weight onto them, but as he waited at the top of them to settle, he felt them holding firmly. A breeze ran cold fingers through his hair as he stared up at the shadows beyond, and then swung himself over the top and dropped down to the other side. As he stood up, the sullen quiet and stillness of the evening hit him. There was never anything like this back in the city, he realised. There was always some background noise covering the natural silence as effectively as wallpaper covering a bare wall. Here, there was only the sound of his own panting breath, of his footsteps as he walked towards the Institute, the sigh of a breeze that raced to catch up with him every so often. There were no streetlights or houses for over a dozen miles in any direction, and the sky above was a luxurious purple, darkening by the minute and studded with glimmering stars. He didn't know if he cared for it much. Perhaps he was too urbanized now after 34 years of city life. Here, it felt as though the world were waiting for something to happen to him. The driveway opened out and the trees fell back, and there in a large clearing was the Brockhampton Institute. Closed now for 20 years, since the children there had done what they did. The fire that gutted the building had been the least of it. Barker tried to picture the three-story building on fire, flames licking at the night sky, clawing for the stars above. When the screaming started deep in his mind, he cut the thought off and shook himself in order to disguise the shiver that ran down his spine. Somebody was rushing up the driveway behind him. He could hear footsteps scratching across the gravel, but as he whirled and an involuntary cry escaped his lips, he saw that it was only a handful of dead leaves scattered by the mischievous breeze, which now sounded so much like faint childish laughter as it raced on through the trees behind him. So much for soaking up the atmosphere, he thought, and managed to laugh softly to himself. As spooky sights go, this certainly wasn't disappointing, but he couldn't imagine anyone would be eager enough to turn it into a tourist attraction. Its history was too disturbing, its secrets too dark. If any ghost remained to haunt the site, he couldn't imagine they'd be the tame and antiquated variety found in tourist guides. He stood on the driveway at the foot of the steps leading up to the main entrance and slid his rucksack from his shoulder to rest at his feet whilst he powered up the camera. The whir of a waking flash and sharp click of a lens cover sliding back seemed amplified by the unnatural quietness of the area. How eerie it must have sounded on that night all those years ago, with the crackling of the flames, the collapse of debris, and the screams of those trapped, the ones who were still alive by then. The thought disturbed him, and as he raised his camera to his face to frame the shot of a building's smoke-seared facade, he felt defenceless against anything that might be creeping up on him. He forced himself not to look over his shoulder, though the temptation was almost unbearable, and held himself rigid whilst he fired off 3 shots from this angle. In the viewfinder, the building turned into a negative of itself every time the flash fired, and the noise sounded like a high, shrill cry somewhere distant. The building had used to look solemn and respectable before the fire. He'd seen pictures of it in old press cuttings and books whilst he'd been researching. A presentable face to cover up the fact that the staff had been abusing the children in their care. It was horrific. Really it was. Barker couldn't think of a worse thing to happen to anybody, and God alone only knew what went on in the minds of the adults who had preyed so mercilessly and coldly upon the defenceless children they were meant to be looking after. Now the building remained, eternally blackened and defeated, and much of its secrets had no doubt been covered up by the fire, though he doubted that such things could ever be cleansed. In time, some developer would no doubt acquire the property and make something new of it, and try to push the facts of its terrible past out with the rubble. How easily greed could overcome other human emotion, especially when it was only the suffering of others that one had to turn a blind eye to. Barker turned away from the front doors and began to walk alongside the blackened shell. Was that the whisper of children he heard, or just the breeze again? He stopped in his tracks, but the rushing of blood in his ears and the sound of his own breath blurred the soft noises indistinguishable. This was no place for children to play, despite the attraction of such a large and abandoned building away from prying eyes. "Hello?" he called out, thinking that if it was just the breeze whispering, then he needn't feel foolish. Something slid around the corner just up ahead, but it must only have been his own shadow amongst the many others as he began walking again, only half satisfied that there was nobody here but him. Weeds grabbed at his ankles in the darkness like the hands of mischievous children trying to trip him up. The eyes he thought were watching him around the corner of the institute seemed further away when he reached it. There had surely been the glimmer of broken glass that carpeted the gravel there. He crunched across some of it, and it must have been the gravel shifting beneath his weight that made it sound as though more people were following him. For he somehow felt more alone out here than ever before. Christ, he needed a cigarette. He fumbled in his jacket and pulled out a half-empty crumpled carton, placing one in his mouth and lighting it with shaking hands. How much atmosphere could he take? He smiled, no longer able to bring himself to laugh. What the fuck was he doing out here? Yet it seemed like a good idea when he'd been settled back in the warmth and familiarity of his flat, mulling over a macabre story that was nothing but words and pictures and the legends which had grown around it. But now that he was actually here, it just felt unsettling and pretty morbid. But he wasn't going to waste his journey completely by going back empty-handed. Once he was away from this place and the intense atmosphere that it still held, he would feel much better and be able to put together a decent piece from his research, his pictures, and his experience of this night. Definitely the experience. Pictures. He'd better take some more. He'd walked a quarter of a way around the building and had no more than a handful of variations of the same shot, nothing particularly thrilling there. He stared off into the dark landscape. In the distance, beyond the clearing, trees reached with long and crooked claws to scratch at the stars. He raised his camera, framing a particularly atmospheric composition of a remote skyline, and as the flash fired, he saw children standing amongst the trees, watching him. He must have been mistaken. As he lowered the camera, he saw only pitch blackness again, but his body felt coated in an icy sweat. It must have only been the twisted formations of the branches that the flash had illuminated and made to look like small immobile figures hand in hand. For why would any children in their right mind be there in complete darkness, just staring at him? He was thoroughly spooked anyway. This would certainly be a night to remember, and he'd got his money's worth from the trip here. He'd always believed that places, buildings, could retain an atmosphere over the years, some more strongly than others. Barker imagined the sheer volume of terror and suffering that the children had endured, the levels of malice and evil that the adults had inflicted. If it had been enough to drive the children to gang up and slaughter the staff before they set fire to the building and to themselves, it was certainly more than enough to leave a residue lingering unpleasantly over the decades. He looked away from the trees and started walking again, and his foot kicked at something that almost sent him sprawling. He looked down and saw a small white arm reaching out of the weeds, bloated and mottled by dampness and age. Fear held him rigid until his eyes grew accustomed to the deeper shadows, and he realized that what he'd kicked was a child's doll. He crouched and picked it up. It felt moist and swollen in his hands. One of its eyes was open, a glassy marble staring up at him, not echoing the humour of a face's flaking, painted smile. As he raised it, the other eye opened automatically, and he saw the socket was empty. The toy fascinated him in some macabre way. How long had it lain here amongst the weeds and the dirt? Who had it belonged to, however long ago? What of the little girl who lost it, suffered, and lived through? Had she died, wondering where her favourite toy was? Barker stuffed the doll into his rucksack and wiped his hands free of the damp and dirt on his jeans. Maybe he should have just taken a picture of the doll and left it where it was. It didn't matter. It was done now, and he turned the corner and stood in the deepest, darkest shadows at the back of the institute. Up there on the top 2 floors had been the children's dormitories. The boys on the top floor and the girls on the middle, if he remembered rightly from the plans he'd seen of his place. Perhaps he had a copy of them amongst his files. He'd have a look tomorrow. Rows of gaping windows were a multitude of open mouths in the face of a building above him, some with teeth of broken glass, others with blackened gums of collapsed timber frame. The breeze whispered and giggled through the deserted building, and he imagined how terrible it would have been to walk through the place just after the fire, charred bodies heaped in the blackened rooms, forever night. He stepped back far enough into the mounds of rubble and broken glass and clutching weeds to take some pictures of this side of the building. Shapes stood further off amongst the weeds, but as he looked closer, he realized it was a small play area. Skeletal climbing frames and swings waited patiently for the children to return and to play. The breeze must have risen again, for as Barker fired off some shots of the playground equipment, he heard the squeaking of old rusted chains as the swings began to move, and the darkness there made him unable to reassure himself that the playground really was as empty as it should have been. The more he stared into the shadows, the more his eyes played tricks upon him, and the shadows seemed to squirm in the aftermath of a camera's flash. Somebody was running towards him from the building. He could hear their footsteps slapping on the gravel. He raised his arms defensively, his heart pounding and cold sweat coating his body. It was a child's ball bouncing along the gravel. As he watched, it stopped bouncing and began to roll towards him. His mouth felt dry and he was shaking. He tried to convince himself that the toy could have just fallen from somewhere, as surely as the old building would occasionally spit out more destroyed and loosened bits of itself when there was nobody around to notice. But the thought that there may be somebody else out here playing pranks on him was not a nice idea, and he decided that it was time to leave. Anybody who would do such things could not be in their right mind, and that wasn't the kind of company he wanted, somewhere as remote and eerie as this. The pale white figures he glimpsed from a corner of his eye, pacing him from window to window on the upper floors of the building, could only be reflections, for nothing human would move in such a jerky and incomplete way. Beneath his quickened breathing, he could imagine that he heard conspiratorial whispers amongst the foliage, soft giggling from within the fire-gutted building. He'd never known that he had such an imagination before, and here and now was neither the time nor the place to exercise it. He just wanted to get back to his car and get the hell away from here, settle his nerves with a stiff drink at the soonest opportunity. Scaring himself witless or falling prey to whatever stupid idiot might be out here playing pranks was not going to help him sell an article. Fuck the pictures. If he didn't have enough already, he'd get some stock images from amongst his research files. There was only so many ways you could photograph a building from its 4 outside walls anyway, and if he'd ever had any notion of going inside to investigate further, then it had been replaced by a much more urgent and overwhelming desire to be seeing the miles tick by on the dashboard as he headed away from his fucking place. Something was running through the weeds up ahead. Barker quickened his pace. So maybe it was just an animal on its nocturnal forays from amongst the woods. It didn't matter. The sooner he was away from here and all the fuel it was offering his fears, the better. He realized with a humorless laugh that he had the ball in his hands. He must have picked it up behind the Institute. Like the doll, it felt soft and pulpy, like something that had lay forgotten amongst the weeds for far too long. When he heard what might have only been the breeze whispering behind him, he turned and threw the ball towards it. "Here!" he called out, his voice cracking as he tried to make light of his fear. "Have your toys back!" Before he knew what he was doing, he was running away from the building and back down the driveway, driven by panic. 100 yards or so up ahead, in the impenetrable blackness, were the gates that he'd climbed, and beyond them the safety and escape that his car offered. Was it the breeze rushing by him as he ran, or the sound of things pursuing through the weeds? It didn't matter, for now that he was running, nothing was going to stop him. The distorted giggling that he heard may only have been his own. Perhaps that was why it sounded far too close for comfort. But he found himself reaching into his rucksack as he ran, dragging out the damp, swollen body of a doll and throwing it behind him like an offering of meat to pursuing hungry wolves. He'd reached the gates. As he flung himself up at them, they rattled alarmingly as though shook by dozens of tiny hands below him. Something grabbed at his leg. He kicked it off and it fell to the gravel behind him with a thud. Perhaps it was only his rucksack, for as he climbed to the top of the gates, he realized he was no longer carrying it. Whatever it was, he didn't look back, just dropped down to the track on the other side of the gates and stumbled towards the car, digging in his pockets for the keys. A pale shape lay in the shadows beside the car. He stopped, even when he heard the gates behind him rattling as though being shaken or even climbed. They were just settling after he jumped from them, that was all. And the shape beside the driver's door of his car was a sign. The sign that he'd seen when he'd pulled onto the track that led down here, and which must have been dragged here and left for him. Beware of the children. He could have laughed, and maybe he did, for he heard a high-pitched giggling over the rattling of the iron gates behind him, over the sound of things dropping down onto the track behind him. Barker thought that if the children's fear had been intense enough to last for decades and create the atmosphere he'd felt back at the Institute, then their hatred for adults must have lasted just as long and been every bit as powerful. As he walked towards the car, he felt something tugging at his jeans, something tugging at his ankle, something tugging at his sleeve. Soft whispers overlapped, but he didn't want to look back, for if he'd thought the doll incomplete, then what would he make of the children themselves? He found the lighter in his pocket, and though the tugging at his clothes and limbs was becoming more and more insistent, he struggled onwards towards the back of a car, to block out the images of things more burned than the building had been, as blackened and charred as only flesh and bone could ever become. He pictured the car's petrol gauge in his mind. He hadn't had enough petrol to drive very far, that much was true, but he certainly had enough to give him and his new playmates one last smoke.